Joining us now for more from Hong Kong, Reuben Mondejar is an adjunct professor of business at the University of Navarra. From Singapore, Lim Tai Wei is a research fellow in the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. With us in the studio, Tran is executive managing director of the Institute of International Finance. And from Beijing, Qinduo is a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institution. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Lim Tai Wei, let's start with you in Singapore. This ASEAN Summit comes at a very important time. As we just heard, there's going to be a big push for growth, but these member states also face other challenges, security challenges, political challenges. And as we heard the Singapore Prime Minister tell us, he wants to see cohesion among the member states. So given all of that, what are the priorities for this summit?
I think the top of the agenda, at least from the host Singapore, there is a desire to link up the smart cities in Southeast Asia. And because there are plans by Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia to build smart cities, through the economy of scale, if these smart cities were able to, if one is able to connect all of them, there would be sort of a very smart grid of cities within ASEAN. And this would help integration, especially since there is ambitions for cross recognition of educational qualification, and also to lower the barriers to people's flow between countries, and also a general desire for greater integration so that ASEAN can better tap into its market of 500 million people, its potential consumer market of 500 million people, in order to compete more effectively with larger economies like, for example, India and China. So there is a sort of awareness that there's a need for ASEAN to come together and sort of integrate their strengths together and to have a more coherent market. This follows on the heels of the December 2015 event when ASEAN quietly formed the ASEAN Economic Community in the hope that within the near future that ASEAN can integrate into a more coherent macroeconomy in terms of size.
Tran, there was recently some good news out of the IMF spring meetings, which were held right here in Washington. The IMF said that global growth is coming back, the main driver being South Asia and Southeast Asia. We just heard from our reporter that average growth of just under 5% is expected to grow this year to more than 5%. Are ASEAN members going to be able to sustain this?
Yes, I think ASEAN members are in a pretty good shape at the moment with growth, like you said, above 5%. And some member countries are growing between 6 to 7%, so strong growth indeed. Inflation is under control around 3%, so overall good macro picture. However, the trade tension and the increase in trade barriers, including tariffs, pose a dark cloud on the bright horizon in the sense that more trade tension and trade tariffs could reduce global trade and global growth. And that could be a challenge for ASEAN to continue to sustain the growth that they have.
Let's go to Reuben. Reuben, this is an optimistic picture that we're getting out of Southeast Asia, but as Tran just pointed out, it comes at a time when there are growing trade tensions between China and the United States over the issues of trade tariffs. How do you think this is going to impact growth and the general economic climate in that part of the world?
Well, I think I look at this in two ways. One is the short term, and the other one is the long term. The short term is, as you have mentioned, how will ASEAN as a unit react to the trade tension once it explodes? The second issue in the trade tension is how each country will react, because the ASEAN countries among themselves are also competitors in some commodities. So therefore, the way they would respond will be always first determined by their national interest. And then in the long term, I think the task of ASEAN is precisely how they can act as a group, because there are other issues that will not stop even while the trade tension is coming up. For example, the South China Sea, practically why this between China and the U.S., the ASEAN countries are practically forced to choose which side they will they will side with. And then other issues among the ASEAN country members, which also will tarnish or improve, depends how it goes. For example, the Rohingya crisis is a global attention-seeking issue. So how will the ASEAN countries react to Myanmar's problem? And then how will that affect the entire ASEAN? So that's the long term. But while the long term is being built up, they have to face the short term. The short term is the trade tension. ASEAN countries are competitors among themselves, and yet they will have to deal with China and the US at the same time.
Tran, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to get back to the first speaker who mentioned the launching of the ASEAN Economic Community. I think that if ASEAN is able to make progress to implement the concept and to make it into a kind of a single market in Southeast Asia, they should be able to trade more and have more economic interaction among themselves. Right now, intra-ASEAN trade is about 25% of total trade of the bloc. And the more they can trade among themselves, the more they can cushion any negative impact of trade tension.
Qinduo Xu, China will be at this summit. China, of course, the biggest economy in the region and the second biggest economy in the world. How does China view these ASEAN partnerships? And as you know, China's the champion of globalization. We've heard this so often from President Xi Jinping. Does China see, ready partners in ASEAN?
Yes, China does. I think China welcomed the further integration of the regional bloc, ASEAN we call, in terms of economic integration, like economic community, because this is of a great significance, in particular at a time when there is a tide against the globalization, against the free trade, and also you see the practice basically by Trump administration of unilateralism. And people see that as a threat to the multilateral trading system. I think for big powers like the US and China, probably they don't care really much about multilateralism in a sense, because they are, big power, big economy. They can afford to have a unilateral approach or bilateral approach. But for mostly, I think, middle-sized or small-sized countries, let's see, like ASEAN countries, people care a lot about, when you have a dispute, there's a place for you to go to settle your disputes in the third party. That is what we call like a dispute settlement mechanism. That mechanism should be given the right authority to, to deal with the disputes between China and the United States. I think that's also the China's idea. That's why China is against the unilateral tariffs imposed on the Chinese goods by the United States. I think there's a similar concern among ASEAN countries.
Lim Tai Wei, if we look at some of the details at this ASEAN Summit, some of the nuts and bolts, if you like, this year's theme is resilient and innovative. That, of course, tracks very closely with what China has been talking about, the move, the focus on innovation as well. What do you see coming out of this conference insofar as that is concerned?
I think this conference is important because, as I mentioned, at least from the host perspective, and I think it's agreed by other ASEAN countries as well, that there's a need for greater integration. And Singapore is trying to push for the integration of smart cities, because smart cities will be the tier 1 cities of ASEAN, the ones that are most able to compete in the next phase of technologies like digital technologies, environmentally sustainable technologies, and other form of cutting-edge technology. So if there was greater cooperation, greater interactions between smart cities, and if these smart cities can form a grid in which they can exchange human talents, information, knowledge, there is a greater chance of ASEAN countries coming together to compete in the global marketplace. At the same time, ASEAN welcomes all forms of trade and business regionalism, economic regionalism. As I mentioned, it formed the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015, but at the same time, it is very enthusiastic about the RCEP Trade Regionalism Agreement. Some of its members are also members of the CPTPP, and also ASEAN countries have participated in China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative for Connectivity.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. Coming up, trade ties dominate the ASEAN Summit as the Southeast Asia economic engine reaches for major growth. More next on The Heat. Stay with us.